Emma was a woman from Boston who once believed that being a good wife meant sacrificing parts of herself. Her career, her independence, even her voice. On a trip to Italy with her husband Josh and his college friends, everything unraveled. After a heated argument outside a cafe, Josh got in the car and drove away, laughing, leaving Emma stranded in a town she couldn't pronounce with no money, no help and no explanation. But what was meant to break her became the beginning of something unexpected. She sold her wedding ring, boarded a night bus and ended up in a quiet Greek village, where strangers welcomed her, offered her shelter and without asking for anything, helped her become whole again. This isn't just a story of abandonment. It's a story of resilience, of choosing yourself, and rewriting everything you thought you'd already lost. You're watching from somewhere in the world, but this story speaks to anyone ready to begin again. I stood alone on the narrow street in the fading Italian light, my suitcase half-zipped, my voice still hanging in the air from the fight we hadn't finished. I didn't believe it at first. I thought it was a joke, a sick, drunken prank that Josh and his friends were pulling just to rattle me. But the laughter coming from the car wasn't the kind of laugh you follow with an apology. It was sharp, triumphant, and cruel. The tail lights of our rental car grew smaller, then disappeared entirely around a bend. Just like that, they were gone. The dust hadn't even settled when my stomach dropped hard. Josh had slammed the door in my face. Pete and Marco, his college buddies, were still laughing when he sped off, leaving me stranded in a tiny town in northern Italy whose name I could barely pronounce, let alone spell. I was still in my sandals from lunch, still wearing a sundress, completely unprepared for the sharp drop in temperature as the sun slipped below the terracotta rooftops. My purse had my passport but not my credit cards. He had those. He had offered to carry them earlier when mine didn't fit in the tiny evening clutch. I had thanked him. He had smiled like the perfect husband. Now that smile felt like a setup. For a moment I just stood there, frozen. Disbelief clung to me tighter than the humidity. My voice cracked when I muttered, "He'll come back," as if saying it would make it true. I could still hear Josh's voice echoing, mocking, "You're so smart, you'll figure it out." That's what he'd said before slamming the door and driving away. Kept checking my phone. 1 call, 2 calls, 5, 10. Nothing. Straight to voicemail. I texted. No reply. Then I called Pete. Walked. All of them. Gone. Like I was a package returned to sender. People at nearby tables outside a cafe were watching me, pretending not to, murmuring in Italian. I must have looked ridiculous, panicked, abandoned American. I wanted to scream. But I couldn't afford the breakdown. Not yet. I started walking. I walked until I found a bench, then sat trying to steady my breath. My fingers trembled as I opened my bag. €80. $37 in crumpled bills. A lipstick, a granola bar, my passport, and a charger I couldn't use without an adapter. I checked my phone again. Battery at 32%. I was no longer a tourist on a romantic European getaway. I was a woman discarded. It was around then the fear began to set in, not loud or dramatic but cold and creeping. What if he didn't come back? What if this wasn't a tantrum? What if this was the plan all along? The longer I sat, the more impossible the answers became. When I had asked Josh earlier that day to ease up on the wine at lunch, it wasn't meant to trigger a war. But the way Pete and Marco laughed, "She's always controlling you, man," fueled him. When I tried to walk away from the cafe, Josh followed. He'd grabbed my arm and hissed accusations, old grievances dug up like rotting roots. Then he let me go, sneered, and walked to the car. "Your purse has your passport, right?" he said. "You'll figure it out." It was no longer just a cruel joke. It was deliberate humiliation. Public abandonment. A move meant to punish. Night fell quickly. What had looked quaint and charming by day became unfamiliar and almost sinister in the dark. The cobblestones hurt my feet. Shops were closing. The weight of everything hit me hard. For a terrifying second I considered walking back to the cafe and begging someone for help. But what would I say? That my husband had ditched me? That I was too embarrassed to ask for help? That I didn't even speak the language? Instead, I found the cheapest pension I could, €30 for a dingy room above a bakery. The bed creaked when I sat on it. The walls were paper-thin. The woman at the front desk didn't speak English, but she looked at me with kind, knowing eyes. She must have seen it before, the wreckage of someone left behind. I locked the door, curled up on the bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to every distant sound. I checked my phone again. Nothing. Not a single text. 27 calls unanswered. I had been erased. And yet somehow I still hoped. Some small part of me, trained by years of keeping peace, swallowing pride, waited for the ding of an apology text. I told myself he would come back. That he'd say it was stupid. That I had overreacted. He didn't come. In the stillness of that tiny room in a foreign town, surrounded by strangers and silence, a part of me began to shift. It was faint, a whisper more than a voice. But it said something I hadn't heard in a long time. You can leave too. The next morning I would have to decide whether to stay here and hope or walk away and become someone else. And that was the first real choice I'd made in years. In the blur of survival, Emma makes a decision that will change her life. And it starts with a pawn shop, a night bus and a one-way trip toward the unknown. By morning the adrenaline had drained from my system, leaving behind a kind of numbness I hadn't expected. My body was heavy. My thoughts sluggish. I stared at the ceiling of the tiny bakery room, listening to the faint thump of early deliveries downstairs and the soft whistle of a kettle I hadn't made. The phone on the side table was still dark. No calls. No messages. Just silence. I hadn't slept, not really. Every time my eyes closed I saw Josh's smirk. Heard the roar of the car engine. Felt the disbelief all over again. But now it wasn't disbelief anymore. It was reality. I was alone and no one was coming. The first thing I did was count the cash again. Still €80. No more. No less. It felt like some kind of cruel joke. That a woman could be discarded and have her entire worth measured in a few bills stuffed into the side pocket of a purse. I knew I couldn't stay in that room another night. The bakery's sugar-sweet warmth clashed with the acid tightening in my stomach. So I left. I walked the perimeter of the town hoping stupidly to spot a familiar face. Maybe a glimpse of Pete at a corner bar. Maybe Marco hungover pretending to be surprised. But the streets were empty. The tour bus that had once been ours was gone. They hadn't just left me behind. They had moved on. Continued their trip like I'd never existed. That afternoon I wandered into a cafe. I hadn't eaten since the granola bar in my bag the night before. My stomach growled, angry. The man behind the counter noticed. He didn't speak much English but he offered an espresso and a small panini. I shook my head not because I didn't want it, but because I couldn't afford to pretend I had more than I did. He slid the plate across anyway, tapping his chest and nodding as if to say, "It's all right." It was the first kindness I'd been shown since arriving in Italy. I almost cried right there. After I ate, I asked him, haltingly, for directions to the nearest police station. He pointed, his instructions simple, and I followed them until I found a squat brick building that looked more like a post office than anything official. Inside, a tired-looking officer listened to my story, nodding often. He didn't seem surprised. In fact, it felt like he'd heard this sort of thing before. But language stood between us like a wall. He filled out a report, stamped it, and handed me a copy I couldn't read. That was all. No follow-up. No help. Just paper. Outside the station the wind picked up. I tightened my cardigan across my chest and stood for a long time, unsure where to go. I could call my dad. I could call one of the 3 friends I hadn't lost contact with over the years. But I didn't. I was afraid. Afraid of their voices. Afraid of the questions. Afraid of hearing, "I warned you about Josh," even if they were right. If I went home I would have to explain everything. I would have to admit that they were right. That I had stayed with a man who didn't just stop loving me. He had gone out of his way to make sure I knew I was disposable. And that was when I saw it. A small pawn shop tucked between a pharmacy and a butcher. The windows were cluttered with old watches, chipped cameras, tangled chains. I stood there for a long moment, my hand slowly curling into a fist. Then I pulled off my wedding ring. Caught the light just for a second. Josh had upgraded it on our 5th anniversary, saying I deserved something more substantial. I'd worn it proudly. I'd shown it off at parties, smiled when people admired it. Now it felt like a shackle. Inside the pawn shop the air was thick with dust and disinterest. The man behind the counter barely looked up when I placed the ring down. He examined it under a lamp, squinted, then tapped a number into a calculator. It was less than half of what I knew it was worth. But it was enough. I nodded. He handed me the money in a quiet stack. I took it with fingers that didn't quite feel like mine. He said something in Italian that I didn't catch. Maybe it was just, good luck. Or maybe, don't come back. At the bus station I scanned the destination board. Rome. Naples. Athens. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew it couldn't be back. I hovered over my father's number one more time. One call and I'd be on a plane by morning. But as my finger hovered, I remembered Josh laughing, tossing my design portfolios behind the couch one day when I mentioned wanting to go back to work. Why complicate things, he'd said. You're doing great at home. That wasn't love. That was control. The woman behind the ticket window looked up at me expectantly. Where you go? She asked. I swallowed. Greece, I said. The furthest coastal village you can get me to. She nodded. And just like that, I bought a ticket to a place I couldn't pronounce in a country I'd never been, using money from a ring I no longer needed. On foreign soil, far from everything she's known, Emma collapses on a rural path, but what finds her there will begin to change everything. 14 hours on a bus does something strange to your body. It wears you down in small, persistent ways. Your legs go numb, your lower back aches, your neck gives up any hope of alignment. But what really breaks you isn't the physical discomfort. It's the silence. The endless passing of towns you can't name, signs you can't read, voices around you that carry no meaning. For those 14 hours I wasn't a person. I was just someone fleeing something I couldn't even explain out loud. When the final bus dropped me off, I stepped into a world that looked like a painting. Whitewashed buildings clung to the hillsides. Olive trees shimmered in the wind like coins catching sunlight. The air smelled of salt and dust. But I wasn't in awe. I was hollow. My phone had died halfway through the journey. My last few euros clinked together in my pocket like ghosts. My feet ached. My shoes, designed for sightseeing not survival, had started to peel at the edges. I had no plan. No language. No map. Only the vague idea that I needed to move forward. So I walked. One foot in front of the other without purpose, until the town behind me shrank into a soft blur of buildings. The trees grew thicker. The road turned to gravel. The sun, which had felt warm earlier, now beat down without mercy. I sipped the last drops of water from my bottle and kept going, though I couldn't tell you why. I wasn't looking for anything. I was simply afraid to stop. Then came the moment I couldn't keep going. My knees gave out before I had the chance to sit down. One second I was upright and the next I was on the ground, the world around me tilting. I remember the rocks digging into my skin. I remember the blinding light of the sky and the faint buzz of cicadas somewhere far off. But I didn't feel pain. Not then. I felt relief. Like maybe I could disappear into the dust and no one would notice. Maybe it would be easier that way. I closed my eyes. And for a few long seconds I let go. Kuritsi Mao, a woman's voice said gently. My girl. I barely registered the words, but the sound of her tone cut through the fog in my mind. Soft hands touched my cheeks. I opened my eyes to see a deeply lined face, dark eyes wide with concern. She spoke again in rapid Greek I couldn't understand, then offered me a dented metal canteen. The water inside was cool, slightly metallic, but it was the most refreshing thing I had ever tasted. Her name was Elena. She repeated it slowly, pointing to herself. Elena. I opened my mouth. Emma, I managed. I mimicked her gesture. Emma. She smiled. It was the first kind smile I'd seen in days. She helped me to my feet with surprising strength. Her frame was small but sturdy, like someone used to lifting heavy things without complaint. She pointed uphill to a stone house nestled among the olive trees. Then she mimed walking. I nodded. I didn't have the energy to speak, let alone argue. We made our way slowly, my feet dragging, the dust caking my legs. The house was old, its walls worn with time, its windows deep-set and shaded. Inside, the air smelled of herbs, oregano, thyme, rosemary, dried and hanging from wooden beams. Something bubbled on a stove I couldn't see. Elena eased me onto a chair at a long wooden table, then called out softly. A man appeared, older than her, with a silver mustache and weathered hands. He glanced at me, then at Elena, his brow furrowed but his eyes kind. Nikos, she said, pointing to him. He nodded, said something in Greek, then disappeared again. She handed me a glass of water, then a bowl of simple soup. Lentils, olive oil, maybe garlic. My stomach growled audibly at the smell. I ate slowly, embarrassed by my hunger but unable to stop. Elena smiled and sat across from me, watching without judgment. When I finished, I tried to explain. I pulled out my phone, now charged thanks to an adapter she had quietly produced. I typed out a broken sentence with the translation app. My husband left me. I have no money. No home. She read it, her brow tightening slightly. Then she nodded as if she had known all along. She didn't ask questions. She didn't pry. She just stood and pointed toward a small hallway. At the end was a narrow room with white walls and a handmade quilt on the bed. She placed her hand on her heart. "Stay," she said. One of the few English words she knew. And I did. That night I slept for the first time in what felt like years. Deep, uninterrupted sleep. No fear. No anxiety. Just rest. In the morning I woke to the sound of roosters and the smell of fresh bread. Clean clothes had been folded at the foot of my bed. A simple cotton dress and a cardigan that didn't belong to me but fit well enough. When I stepped into the kitchen, Elena beamed at the sight of me. She handed me a slice of bread, still warm, and gestured to the seat. Her eyes twinkled with a quiet kind of peace I hadn't known since childhood. I sat down. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't anyone's wife. I wasn't a project, a burden, or an embarrassment. I was just Emma. Emma tries to repay her hosts. But Elena has other plans. What begins as a temporary stay becomes something far more personal. The days that followed didn't unfold with drama or spectacle. They were quiet. Ordinary even. But in that quiet something began to repair. Each morning started with the same rhythm. Rooster calls before dawn. The scent of fresh bread curling through the kitchen like a greeting. Elena humming to herself as she ladled olive oil into a pan. She never rushed me. Never expected. But somehow her patience made me want to move. Want to help. So I did. I started with small things, sweeping the floor, folding linens, bringing in firewood. But Elena had no intention of letting me stay in the background. She handed me a basket one morning and gestured to the hen house. She mimed collecting eggs, pressing a finger to her lips with a mischievous smile as if the chickens might take offense if I wasn't gentle. I obeyed. I tiptoed. I flinched the first time a hen squawked and Elena chuckled from the doorway. She didn't laugh at me. She laughed with me. It had been so long since anyone had done that. Over the next week she showed me more: how to hang laundry so the mountain wind would catch it just right, how to sort herbs from weeds in the garden, how to knead bread without measuring a single thing. Her hands moved with instinct. Mine fumbled at first. But she never corrected me with impatience. Only quiet repetition and trust. Nikos, meanwhile, remained a quiet figure in the background. He rose early, tended the olive trees, tinkered in the shed. But gradually he began to include me. One afternoon he led me into the grove and pointed out the difference between the younger trees and the old giants. He placed my hand on a branch and guided my fingers to a patch of blister, saying a word I didn't know but understood: disease. He mimed trimming, treating, waiting. His way of teaching was hands-on, unspoken, and strangely comforting. I hadn't used my body like this in years. Not like this. Not to sweat in the sun, not to ache at night from labor. In Boston, my days had been a mix of Pilates classes and errands, carefully timed lunches with Josh's clients' wives. My energy had gone toward managing image of our home, our marriage, my presence. But here my energy made things grow. Clean feet. My hands began to change. Softer skin gave way to calluses. Fingernails grew blunt. My reflection became foreign. Less polished, more sun-worn. But I didn't mind. When I caught myself in the bathroom mirror above the rusted sink, I didn't feel the usual flicker of criticism. I saw a woman doing something. Not decorating, not performing. Being. One afternoon I tried to express my gratitude. I used the translation app again, typing slowly. "I want to repay you." Or earn. Elena frowned at the screen, then took my phone and typed her own response. The translation blinked into English. "You help by being here." It stunned me. Being enough, just by existing, was a concept that didn't fit easily inside me. With Josh, everything had been transactional. If I wanted affection, I had to anticipate his moods. If I wanted peace, I had to soften mine. Even love had been something I worked for, like a job with no weekends. But here I wasn't performing. I wasn't being evaluated. I was simply allowed. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to do more. That I had to repay something. So I tried to leave. 3 times over the course of a few days I gathered my things. I even reached the front door once, shoes on, bag slung across my shoulder. Each time Elena stopped me, never with force, only with her face. A certain wounded look that said, "Please, not yet." On the third attempt she didn't stop me at the door. She led me to the living room instead and pulled down a wooden box from the mantel. Inside were photos, black and white portraits, faded color prints. She pointed to a young woman in one of them. Dark hair like Elena's, a smile like Nikos's. "Sophia," she said. "Her daughter." Then she held her hands as if cradling a baby and pointed far into the distance. "Australia." Another photo followed. A baby girl less than a year old. Elena pressed her fingers to her lips, then her heart. Gone. No visits. No return. And suddenly it clicked. I wasn't just a guest. I was a placeholder. A presence for someone who couldn't be there. But rather than feel used, I felt trusted. I nodded slowly and set my bag down by the hook again. After that day I stopped trying to leave. I let myself fall into the rhythm of their life. I learned the names of plants in Greek. I learned how to tell when the bread was done just by the scent. I even let Elena teach me how to knit. My first scarf came out lumpy, but her pride in it made me feel like I'd created something rare. The nights were the quietest time. We'd sit on the porch after dinner. Nikos would smoke his pipe. Elena would knit. And I would simply breathe. No words. No expectations. Just peace. The pain of what had happened, of Josh's betrayal, of the life I'd abandoned, hadn't vanished. But it was no longer the only thing inside me. There was space now. For something softer. A single question from Elena forces Emma to confront her past, and choose whether to keep running from it or finally stop and take root. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. The kind where the sky held that sleepy kind of blue, and the only sounds were the shuffle of bare feet against stone and the rustle of leaves turning in the wind. We were sitting at the wooden table behind the farmhouse, a bowl of peas between us, snapping pods open in quiet rhythm. Elena didn't speak right away. She watched me carefully, her fingers still working, her brow slightly furrowed in thought. Then she asked softly, "Home?" She said it with a curious tilt to her voice, like she wasn't asking where I came from, but whether I still believed in the place I'd left behind. She made a gentle motion with her hand, sweeping it toward the horizon, then tapped her chest and pointed to me. "You go home." It landed like a stone dropped into a still lake. Home. The word should have comforted me, but instead it unraveled something I hadn't touched yet. I opened my mouth to respond and found I had no answer. Because the truth was, I didn't know where home was anymore. I stared at the peas in my hands, blinking fast as tears welled in my eyes. And then, for the first time since arriving, I let it out. The words came slowly, raw and tangled. I told her about Josh. Not just what he did in Italy, but who he had been for years. I told her how he had chipped away at me piece by piece. How I had given up my career because he said we didn't need the money. How I had stopped seeing friends because he found fault with each one. How I had smiled through parties full of strangers because it kept things easier. I had called it compromise. But it wasn't. It was erasure. I spoke through sobs, ashamed and shaking, the translation app struggling to keep up. Elena didn't interrupt. She didn't reach for the phone. She simply placed her hand over mine and held it there. When I finished, she didn't speak right away. He didn't have to. She pointed to her chest, then to the farmhouse, then gently to me. It wasn't a question anymore. It was an invitation. I looked around at the quiet space that had taken me in with no questions, no judgment, no demands. The cracked stone under my feet. The smell of garlic and lemon floating from the kitchen window. The basket of uneven, lopsided knitting I was slowly learning to master. And suddenly the idea of going back didn't feel like returning. It felt like disappearing all over again. I swallowed. "Work," I said, mimicking Nikos in the olive grove. "I stay. I help." The words were clumsy, but the intent was clear. Elena's eyes filled with warmth. She smiled, not surprised, not even excited, just quietly pleased, like she had known all along. She squeezed my hand, then returned to the peas as if we had merely agreed on tomorrow's dinner, not the rest of my life. From that moment on, things changed. The next morning, Elena woke me before sunrise. The stars were still scattered across the sky when she handed me a set of work clothes. Sturdy boots, a linen shirt, and pants that once belonged to Sophia. They were too long and baggy, but they made me feel grounded. Ready. We walked in silence to the olive grove. The trees loomed tall and ancient, their trunks twisted like they had secrets they'd never share. Elena pointed to a set of low branches heavy with ripe fruit. Elise, she said. She showed me how to use the wooden rakes, gently combing the branches so the olives would fall into the nets spread below. At first I was clumsy, shaking twigs and leaves loose in a rain of mess. Nikos watched from a distance, then walked over and corrected my angle without a word. His hands were firm but kind. By mid-morning my arms were sore, my back ached and sweat clung to my neck and chest. I was filthy, exhausted, and more alive than I'd felt in years. When we stopped for lunch, Elena disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a small tin of salve, thick and fragrant with beeswax and herbs. She took my blistered hands in hers and rubbed it in with care. "Tomorrow better," she said with a wink. And she was right. The next day was easier. And the one after that. I learned to feel the branches rather than fight them, to listen to the rhythm of the harvest. I began to work alongside Elena and Nikos not as a guest or an outsider, but as a part of something. Each night I collapsed into bed with the kind of exhaustion that left no room for worry. Only sleep. The olive trees weren't just work. They were ritual. They were life. And somewhere among them I had planted something too. Not roots exactly. Not yet. But something close. I hadn't just chosen to stay. I had chosen to begin. The work continues. But when Emma receives her first wages from the harvest, she realizes this life is no longer charity. It's hers. The olive harvest came slowly, then all at once. Each morning began before the sun. Elena and I would pack a basket with bread, olives and hard cheese, then head into the grove with Nikos, boots crunching over dry soil. The trees stretched wide and proud, some older than memory, their trunks gnarled like fists softened by time. There was something sacred in the way we worked among them. Not hurried, not frantic, but steady. Intentional. I learned to feel the difference between ripe and overripe olives. I learned how to handle the nets gently, how to separate out the bad fruit without bruising the good. My body ached in new ways. My fingers were perpetually stained, my nails rimmed with dirt I couldn't scrub out no matter how hard I tried. And I didn't care. For the first time in years, my body was doing something useful. Not ornamental. Not decorative. It had purpose. One morning, while sorting olives under the shaded pergola behind the house, Nikos leaned in, studied my hands and grinned. "Boston lady hands," he said, his Greek thick with amusement. He mimed delicate fingers, then held mine up, calloused now, rough-edged, strong. "No more." I laughed out loud, louder than I expected. It surprised even me. A full, deep sound from the gut. And in that laugh I felt something shift. Like something cracked open and sunlight got in. That evening, after a long day of harvest and sorting, Elena and Nikos called me into the kitchen. On the table sat a plain white envelope. No decoration, no ceremony. "For you," Elena said. I hesitated. I wasn't expecting anything. I had never asked for money. I had assumed, maybe wrongly, that I was simply earning my place in room and board. When I opened it and saw the neatly stacked euros inside, my hands trembled slightly. It wasn't a lot. Not by Boston standards. Not enough to cover even one of the dinners Josh and I used to host in our pristine dining room with matching wine glasses and arranged seating. But it was mine. Wages. Earned. I looked at Elena, at Nikos. They said nothing. They didn't need to. This wasn't charity. This wasn't pity. It was fair work. For fair pay. That night I sat alone in the small spare room, the envelope beside me on the bed. I touched it more than once just to make sure it was still real. Not because of the money itself, but because of what it meant. Josh used to control everything tied to money. He framed it as protection. "We're a team. It's just easier if I handle the accounts." Over time that meant I stopped knowing what we had or where it went. My credit cards were linked to accounts he monitored. The passwords changed without explanation. I told myself it was normal. Efficient. Smart. Now I understood. It was a cage with comfortable curtains. But this envelope? This was the key. Not to wealth, not to freedom in the dramatic sense, but to independence. Dignity. I tucked it under my pillow like a child with a secret. Not out of fear. Out of reverence. Over the next few weeks, we prepared the products. Bottling the oil, pressing it into small glass jars, sealing them by hand with wax that Elena melted over the stove. We wrapped olive soap in recycled brown paper tied with twine. Labeled them all in my careful handwriting. Elena insisted I write the English descriptions. For tourists, she said, tapping her temple. The Saturday market came like a gust of color. Tents and tables sprung up around the village square, stalls filled with figs, wine, carved spoons, hand-stitched linens. I'd never seen anything like it. We set up our table early. Nikos arranged the oil bottles like soldiers. Elena wiped every jar clean with the edge of her apron. Then they pushed me forward. To the front of the table. The face of the product. I froze. I wasn't ready. But a woman approached, a guidebook in one hand, curiosity in the other. "Do you speak English?" she asked. I nodded. And I began. Broken Greek. Hesitant explanations. Stories of how the olives were harvested, how the oil was pressed, how Elena used only lemon and salt in her cooking because the oil is the star. My voice shook at first. Then steadied. By midday we'd sold almost everything. When we packed up, Elena pressed another envelope into my hand. "Your part," she said, simple as breath. I didn't argue. I didn't deflect. I just said thank you. That night I didn't think about Josh at all. Not once. My head was filled with market conversations, with the scent of rosemary soap and the sound of Elena humming as she counted the money into her apron. And in that silence, free of regret, free of fear, I realized something I hadn't dared to hope for. I wasn't just recovering. I was becoming. Emma joins her first village dinner, only to discover Elena and Nikos have a life-changing proposition, and they're ready to offer her more than belonging. They want her future. The invitation came without warning. That morning, Elena handed me a soft cotton blouse, freshly laundered, and a hair tie with a wink. "Tonight. Taverna," she said, brushing imaginary dust from my shoulder. I stared at her, confused, until she tapped the calendar hanging near the door. A name I didn't recognize was circled. Later, I learned it wasn't anyone's birthday or anniversary. It was just a dinner. A gathering. Something they hadn't invited me to before, because I hadn't been ready. But tonight I was. When we walked into the village taverna, the lights were low and golden. Warm. Familiar. The owner, Stavus, clapped his hands when he saw Elena and Nikos, embracing them both. Then he turned to me, curious. "Our American," Elena said proudly in Greek. My cheeks flushed. But I didn't flinch. We took our seats at their usual table, tucked near a window that looked out toward the sea. The air smelled of grilled fish, wine, and oregano. Glasses clinked all around us. Conversations overlapped. The village was alive. I was halfway through my meal, tender lamb roasted with lemon and garlic, when Nikos cleared his throat. A gesture I had come to understand as significant. "Elena and I," he said slowly in careful English, "want talk business." My heart paused. Had I overstepped? Was my time here ending? Elena reached across the table and touched my hand. "No children here," she said softly, pointing between herself and Nikos. "Sophia, in Australia. Not coming back." She looked at him, then at me. Nikos nodded. "We retire soon," he said. "But trees," he gestured to the hills. "Trees live long. Need hands. Need care." Elena reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. A draft, handwritten with a printed translation beneath. She slid it across the table. "Partnership agreement. 1/3 ownership. Starting now. No conditions. No deadlines. Just belief." I sat stunned, the noise of the taverna falling away around me. They were offering me more than a home. More than kindness. They were offering me a life. "But I don't know enough," I said, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. "The trees, the oil, the books." "You learn," Nikos said firmly. "We teach." Elena just smiled and returned to her glass of wine, as if we had settled something simple and obvious. Something inevitable. I didn't sleep much that night. Not from doubt, but from a sense of weight. Responsibility. A choice that finally felt like mine. But in the days that followed, I stepped into the role. I studied. I listened. I asked questions. I began tracking inventory in a spreadsheet I created from scratch. I worked beside Nikos, side by side, mapping the groves, learning the history of each tree. I practiced Elena's recipes until they tasted like hers. And just when things felt steady, when I thought perhaps I had escaped the storm completely, the email came. I was in my room checking for a message from a contact I'd reached out to for freelance design work. Something remote, something small, when I saw it. From Josh Davis. Subject: I know where you are. My body went cold. The message was short, direct. His tone unmistakable. It's taken months and a private investigator, but I finally tracked you down in Greece. This has gone on long enough. I'm coming to bring you home and end this ridiculous tantrum. My flight lands Thursday. Be ready. I stared at the screen, pulse pounding. His words burned through every inch of progress I'd made, mocking it, dismissing it, reducing it to drama, to immaturity, to something to be corrected. I went downstairs, phone in hand, the kitchen blurring around me. Elena looked up from the ledger she was balancing and stilled. Bad news from America? She asked gently. I nodded. Josh. He's coming. She held my gaze, calm and certain, then reached beneath the table and pulled out an envelope. She slid it toward me. Was waiting for right moment. Inside were official papers. Translated. Signed. Legal. Partnership agreement. My name beside theirs. No longer a guest. No longer a helper. An equal. You choose what happens Thursday, Elena said, her voice steady. You have home here. Business. Friends. She didn't tell me what to do. He didn't have to. For the first time since Josh drove away laughing, I knew exactly who I was. And I knew what I would say when he arrived. The car pulls up. Josh steps out. But he won't find the woman he once abandoned. He'll find someone reborn, ready to end the story on her own terms. The sound of the car reached me before I saw it. A low engine hum, unfamiliar in this part of the countryside. It wound up the dirt road like an intruder, out of place, too polished for the olive trees and stone walls that had come to define my world. I stood in the processing shed, hands still slick with oil, sorting samples with Nikos when Elena appeared in the doorway. He is here, she said simply. I wiped my palms on my apron. My heart pounded, but not from fear. From certainty. I stepped outside. Josh stood beside a sleek rental sedan, one hand resting on the door like a prop in a commercial. He wore tailored chinos, a crisp button-down and designer sunglasses. His hair was perfectly styled, as if he'd stepped out of a Boston office just that morning. He didn't see me at first. He was too busy looking at the farmhouse, the dirt path, the simple life that surrounded him with visible distaste. When he turned and saw me, he froze. I didn't speak right away. I let him look. Let him take in the work boots, the sun-browned arms, the simple braid pulled back with a cloth tie. I wasn't the woman he had left behind in Italy. I didn't want to be. Josh, I said, my voice steady. What are you doing here? He took off his sunglasses with practiced charm and stepped forward, arms slightly open. Lex, he said, using a nickname I no longer answered to. Let's be done with this. I've come to take you home. I didn't move. This is home, I said calmly. He blinked. Come on. This. He gestured to the house, the grove, my clothes. This isn't you. What point are you trying to make? It's not about a point, I replied. It's about a life. A real one. Behind me, I heard the soft steps of Elena and Nikos. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They stood behind me, silent but solid. Witnesses to the woman I'd become. Josh noticed them, his expression darkening. Are they the ones keeping you here? Have they done something? They've taught me, I said. About olive farming. About community. About trust. No strings attached. No conditions. He scoffed. You're a designer. Not a farmer. This is, what, your eat, pray, love moment. I didn't flinch. You abandoned me. Left me alone in a foreign country. You haven't called in months. And now you expect me to come running because you're ready to pretend none of that happened. I said it was a mistake, he snapped. I was drunk. I overreacted. You always take things too seriously. I reached into my apron pocket and pulled out the partnership agreement. This is not a phase. I have legal responsibilities here now. A third of this business belongs to me. This life is mine. He stared at the document, then back at me, confused. What are you talking about? I didn't answer. I stepped forward and placed another envelope into his hands. Divorce papers. His mouth opened. You're throwing everything away? No, I said quietly. I'm choosing something better. He laughed, but it came out hollow. When you're 60 and still hauling buckets in the sun, don't say I didn't warn you. I smiled. I'd rather live with the consequences of my own choices than with the regret of choices you made for me. Nikos stepped forward, placing a hand on my shoulder. He said something in Greek. Josh glanced between us. What did he say? He said, I translated, the road back to Athens is dangerous after dark. You should leave now. Josh stared at me for a long moment, but there was nothing left to say. He walked to the car without another word. The engine started. The tires kicked up dust. And then he was gone. Elena slipped her hand into mine. We turned back toward the house. There were samples to catalog, dinner to prepare, a market stall to plan for. The man who once defined my world had tried to teach me a lesson about dependence. But in doing so he had broken the spell. He hadn't left me ruined. He had set me free. And in the ruins of his cruelty, I had built something unshakable. Not a comeback. A beginning. And that was how it ended, not with a tearful goodbye or a dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet, unwavering choice. I didn't just walk away from a man who abandoned me. I stepped into a life I chose for myself. One olive at a time, one sunrise at a time. I learned that healing doesn't come all at once. It arrives in small, patient moments. In hands that blister, in bread you bake from scratch, in the sound of your own laughter returning after being silent for too long. Sometimes, the greatest freedom begins the moment someone thinks they've broken you. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to rebuild your life from something that nearly destroyed you? What did that moment of power look like for you? If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more stories about strength, resilience, and becoming who you were meant to be.